Hello and welcome to NIL Edge, the show where the people shaping the future of name, image, and likeness talk about how they're doing it, what's working, and how they're looking to improve NIL for student athletes. If you're inside an athletic department, a brand trying to navigate smarter partnerships, a student athlete, or the parent of a student athlete, this is the space for you. Each episode, we talk to NIL directors, brand leaders, and other innovators pushing the NIL conversation forward. Our goal is to have this space be a spot to share stories, equip you with ideas, and create a trusted space for NIL strategy and alignment. This show is produced in partnership with NIL Newsstand and Digital Sport by Hot Paper Lantern. I'm your host, Sterling Randall. I come from the world of strategic communications and public relations. Before that, I worked in collegiate athletic departments as an SID. So I've seen firsthand how critical communications, compliance, and brand building play a role in today's NIL era. Now I work with brands and organizations at the intersection of sports and strategy, help them navigate change, protect their reputations, and connect athletes to fans and businesses in meaningful ways. Today, we're joined by Brennan White from Illinois State. I'm really excited for this conversation. So without further ado, let's do it. Today's guest is Brennan White, the Assistant AD General Manager and NIL Administration from Illinois State, where he works at the center of NIL strategy. Brennan brings a people-first approach to building NIL in an environment shaped by smaller resources, evolving state laws, and a stronger focus on football and men's basketball. His perspective highlights what it really takes to make NIL work at the FCS level and why relationships and trust still matter the most. Brennan, thank you so much for joining us, and how the heck are you?
Doing good, Sterling. Really appreciate you having me on the show, and excited to be here and represent Illinois State and the Redbirds.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. Really excited to talk about what you guys have going on in Normal and kind of talk about the success that you guys have had this last fall athletic year. But first, tell us a little bit about your background. I know when we talked previously, you're a former collegiate athlete, like a lot of the other guests that it seems that we've had on. But tell us about your background and where you got today with Illinois State.
Yeah, so a little bit about me. I'm from a very small farm town about 20 minutes south of Springfield, Illinois. So it's about an hour 45 south of Bloomington. Grew up there most of my life. Was a three-sport athlete all throughout high school. I had the competitiveness of a Division I athlete, just not the physical attribute. But I was very fortunate. I had the opportunity to go play Division III football at Monmouth College. Was a part of 3 conference championships there. Very fortunate experience because, that's the purest form of football that there is in college athletics these days. Graduated from there. Was fortunate enough to be accepted into Illinois State's graduate program, and I got my master's in sport management. I spent 2 years here as a graduate assistant with our track and field team as the director of operations. During that time, I also worked at a local business that had done a couple NIL deals with Illinois State student athletes. So, it was twofold, right? I had, the inside knowledge of kind of how day-to-day college athletics was working, but then also, what a business expects from an NIL perspective when they do deals with student athletes. Graduated in May of 2023, and then was hired into this role in August of 2023. And it was originally titled Director of NIL. And then I was fortunate enough over the summer, they moved me into an assistant AD role as the GM and overseeing NIL as a whole.
That's awesome. And then so I want to jump right into there. So when you got hired, NIL was very different, not only because it was rather new, but the way that FCS was dealing with it, you were heavily restricted, which is basically what I'm trying to get to. What are some of the early challenges that you had to navigate, and how did you get over those barriers and resolve those and gain the momentum for where you guys are today?
Yeah, it was a really interesting scenario stepping into. We had an interim AD at the time. My current boss, who serves as our deputy AD, had just been hired right after I was, and then we also had a brand new president of our NIL collective at the same time, right? So we truly started from the ground up and had to build a foundation. I think early on the challenges were just figuring out what we were allowed to do. There were so many restrictions on, what we couldn't do in terms of our involvement with the collective or even if a business reached out to me and said, hey, we want 5 student athletes for, this opportunity, I couldn't even give them a list of student athletes, right? So I think it was figuring out, number one, what are we allowed to do? What are the rules? How do we stay compliant? But then two, how do we execute and still not use those things as an excuse and remain competitive and provide our student athletes with opportunities? And, I think what we did really well early on was defining our process and our structure. What achieve in this, regardless of the rules, while those are so important to follow, what do we want it to look like here at Illinois State? And for us, that was create opportunities and drive revenue. And I'll give a shout out to Brian Mason at Wisconsin. I stole that from him early on when he was coaching me up a little bit in the NIL world. So appreciate his advice and his insight on that. But I think the second part of it was, just forming relationships. Again, it's you're here to serve people, and it's, building relationships with the student athletes, the coaches, faculty, administration, and then importantly our donors, right? Because they're the backbone to the whole operation that, we're trying to do. So again, it was, I think a big part of it was communication and making sure that everybody was on the same page.
Yeah. And shout out to Brian, who's also a guest on the show. I really liked what you said about the building the process. I took some notes about that because later I want to talk about that. But now I don't want, obviously you're the first person from the FCS level to come on and talk to our show. I don't want our conversation to be about like the haves and the have-nots. I did not work at the FCS level, but I worked at the small G5 level, where it seemed like we were always fighting, fighting for resources, fighting for attention, like fighting for everything. Right. So I feel like I understand, what you're going through there. And I don't you can have NIL success anywhere, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are and where you are, but I just want to like establish that difference. So, and in our previous conversation, we talked about how, budgets and resources are tighter and thinner. Like, how do you prioritize? And I want to talk a little bit more about the building the process, right? Because I think that's part of this. How do you prioritize everything in the NIL like foundation and structure so that is the most effective for your student athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately comes down to not chasing volume and chasing impact, right? Because, at the end of the day, even though it's the FCS level, we don't have a ton of student athletes that have extremely large followings like it would at the FBS level, right? We don't have a ton of student athletes that are, I think, even over 50,000. So when it comes to the NIL side of things, it's, again, building the foundation and just figuring out like, who do we want to be as Illinois State, and not worrying about any of the external factors and focusing on the product that we can deliver to our student athletes here, right? Or controlling what you can control. I think from a revenue sharing side of things, because those are the two pots that you're in right now, especially at the FCS. Rev share, obviously, with everything coming in house, has become ever so important. Again, it's prioritizing, how we spend our dollars. And, obviously the coaches are the CEOs of their program and they make the final call on that. But, we have to be extremely smart. You can't overspend. And you can't believe everything that you hear on social media or, what other coaches or conferences may say. You got to focus on the product that we're building here, because at the end of the day, that's all we can control.
Yeah, I think that second part is key. I remember coaches. I specifically had a coach come share something with me on social media, and they're like, "Sterling, look at this video." And then I was like, "Well, yeah, coach, that's the University of Georgia that you just shared with me. They're going to be able to put out stuff like that. So you can't, comparison's going to kill you." In our previous conversation, and I know we just talked about it this morning, you said that you win with people, and I know you said that that's a quote from one of the coaches that you work with. What does that mean in practice when you're building an NIL program at Illinois State?
Yeah. Obviously got to give a shout out to our head men's basketball coach, Coach Peden. The guys just had a huge win last night over Murray State. So congratulations to them. I think it means investing in relationships before outcomes, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not curing cancer. This is college athletics. And I think sometimes, it's very easy to get caught up in the wins and losses and the dollars and cents. But coaches, donors, businesses, et cetera, if they all trust you and it's a genuine organic relationship, I think NIL becomes much more sustainable. um, but it's also, the people make the party, right? Like that's
Yeah.
why it's like we're all working in college athletics, not for our own personal outcomes. While we want to grow our careers, we're here to leave a lasting impact. I know for me, just myself, like if it wasn't for college football, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair right now on this interview. So I think it just comes back to paying it forward, right? At the end of the day, rev share and NIL are going to be extremely important in retaining and recruiting talent to your teams. But I think we also can't forget that, these young men and women are human beings as well. We can't forget to invest in them and their futures. Because at the end of the day, that's our overall mission statement, right? To create the future leaders of tomorrow, at least here at Illinois State. Um, and, we have to execute on that.
Um, okay, so I want to go in a little bit more and talk about kind of the NIL success that football and men's basketball has had. I would love for you to share maybe some examples of success at the NIL level from each of those sports, but then also talk about how you balance that between NIL success at the whole athletic department level as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a really good job at balancing it right now. Especially basketball team. They're one of the only teams in the Valley, to my knowledge, that has a student athlete on a car deal with a local dealership here in town. And then we know where we're at in the conference right now from a rev share standpoint, and we're right at the top with a couple other schools. So I think we've done an incredible job at being very intentional with our programs. But also, if you look at the way the Valley is structured, in the Missouri Valley Football Conference,
Mm-hmm.
we're that also heavily prioritizes basketball, and then vice versa in just the regular Missouri Valley, because not as many other schools are prioritizing football like we
Mm-hmm.
are. So again, I think it just comes down to being very intentional with what we're trying to do. And unfortunately, it's not always going to be balanced correctly, right? A lot of it is donor driven for us. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not outcome. But I think we've done an incredible job at making sure that our programs are going to remain very competitive. Um, but again, it goes back to, we have to control our own market, right? We have to control how we prioritize dollars. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we understand, we're not always going to have the most money in the Valley, or at a national level at the FCS, but I don't think you need to.
Mm-hmm.
Build sustainable rosters in this landscape that we currently live in. And we just saw that on our run to the national championship. Some of the teams we ran into where they were at, and it was a lot more than we had. We'll just put it like allegedly. So it comes back to controlling your own market and not overspending.
Yeah. So I want to dig into a little bit on your guys' national title run. How have you guys used that as a whole, and how have you individually used that to change the conversation internally and externally with NIL at Illinois State?
Yeah, I mean, it was so special to be a part of. The run that we went on, obviously, winning 4 games on the road to make it to the national championship, just was very excited for our coaching staff and most importantly our student athletes to get to experience something like that. But I think from a validation standpoint, internally and externally, it showed everybody, you can do it. It's not just the North Dakota States or the Montanas. Um, you don't have to have the most money in FCS football. Like you can build a team and put it together and still make a run like that. So, I think internally it showed everybody, how close we really are. Unfortunately, we were on the losing end of one of the greatest college football games I've ever seen.
It was
Uh,
awesome.
person. Uh, But that's football. Sometimes you get the short end and that's all you get. You got to give credit to Montana State. They made plays down the stretch and we just didn't, right? So, but I think internally, it proved that, we're very, very well capable of making it to that stage. But I think externally, when we made it back in 2014, 2015, it
Mhm.
wasn't a thing, right? It was the ultimate sin at that point in college athletics to pay players. So I think now showing our fans that, hey, we're right there. And this isn't the time to take a step back in supporting, the football program. Like it takes all of us and it takes what it takes to get to that level. So, I think it showed our fans that, you don't have to have $1 million rosters to get to that stage.
Have there been any businesses after the national championship run that have been like maybe on the fence, or, you weren't able to speak with, but with the national championship run, phone calls are being answered and emails are being returned now?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about NIL is when you get that type of national attention, which was obviously kind of a first for us, because I believe, when it went into overtime, I think there were close to 3 million viewers. That's a really big deal for us in terms of the
Mhm.
exposure we're getting. So, it wasn't just businesses, it was, donors, people in college athletics reaching out. I think it was a domino effect, so to speak. And it's been an absolute game changer for us ever since.
Okay, so I want to go back to the comparison point that we talked about earlier, and how you go about in educating student athletes at Illinois State about NIL opportunities and like setting the stage. Because again, it's probably so easy to log on to Twitter, see something on TikTok, and it's like, holy cow, this student athlete at University X just got this deal. Like, I'm, I know I'm better than them and I can get this deal. So how do you properly educate student athletes, and it's in a way that you can make sure you're realistically delivering um, and meeting proper expectations when it comes to NIL at the FCS level?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously the cliche statement, comparison is the thief of joy. And I think with social media, right, student athletes all over the country, not just at ISU, are exposed to what other people are doing. But I think from an education standpoint, we're very honest with our student athletes. We meet with all 19 sports when everybody comes back in the fall to
Mhm.
coach a bit on the rev share and NIL space, because it changes every week. So
Mhm.
we do what we can to make sure we put as much information in front of them so that they can make the best informed decision for themselves, their brand, their futures, etc. But I think focusing on, development and consistency, right? Because most of our student athletes don't have huge followings on social media, right? So it's being honest and where you're at and figuring out,
Mhm.
okay, you are here. How do we get you to where you want to be? And I tell student athletes all the time, my least favorite saying in life is be realistic, but you got to have some realistic expectations, right? You're probably not going
Mhm.
to be or Gatorade, um, but that doesn't mean you can't get deals with other people, right?
Yeah.
So the way I frame it to our student athletes, when you look at NIL, right, like true, authentic grassroots NIL, can you take yourself out of your jersey, uniform, etc., and people still know who you are? That's true NIL to me. And then on the flip side of that, when you're exploring deals with businesses or the potential deal with a business, what value do you that business that they
Mhm.
don't have or are willing to pay for, right? Because I think that's the challenging part in getting student athletes to understand ROI. And
Mhm.
the whole point of a business is to make money. So how do
Mhm.
you into that business and help them with exposure or selling a certain product or reaching the 18 to 24-year-old demographic, which is really challenging to reach these days. Um, so it's easier said than done, but I think that's the fun in this role.
Yeah. Okay. It's I really I like the phrase true, like what you said, this is true NIL. So to make sure, again, that you're meeting expectations and again, a phrase that every NIL director that we've talked to says, meeting student athletes where they're at. Along with, so what do you do to make sure that you're meeting student athletes where they're at? You said that you meet with them when they arrive to campus. Is there an intake form? Are you the type of person that's like, hey, my office door is always open. You can come talk to me. We can workshop stuff. How do you make sure that these student athletes are experiencing true NIL?
Yeah, I have an open door policy. All of the student athletes know where my office. They all text me at all hours of the night and all hours of the morning. So they know how to get in contact with me. But I think, for me, meeting them where they're at is figuring out, what is NIL in your mind? Like, what is it to you? And then how do we make that come a reality, right? And so, I think, whether they're interested in NIL when they come into my office, sitting down with them, getting to understand, where they came from, what they're interested in, different things like that, so that we can explore, business outreach ideas or brand partnerships. So I think it's also like when you look at it all, we don't want to just sign deals to sign deals, right?
Yeah.
Like I want student athletes to understand, like, we need to have a good intention behind it, but also, a process oriented mindset of, I tell them, like, don't just text me and say, hey, got any NIL deals available? I say, I receive text messages like that. And, again, that's not saying I don't want you to be interested in NIL, but don't just think it's going to happen, right? It's no different than fighting for a starting position or trying to earn an A in a class, right? Like, it's going to take work. And especially for us at the FCS level, we don't have unlimited businesses to choose from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So very, very intentional with those relationships, because we want those to be long-lasting relationships. Because, in my mind, the golden rule of business is it takes forever to build trust, and it takes one bad experience to mess it up, right? So we don't want anybody to be on the wrong end of that.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I absolutely love that. So going into that, how, like, what role do these local businesses play at Illinois State? Obviously, at an FCS school compared to some FBS institutions, you're in a smaller regional area. You're not necessarily maybe in a giant metropolitan area. So what role do local businesses and, more regionally based businesses play in NIL at Illinois State?
They're the backbone. Like, they are, for us, we are extremely fortunate for the local economy we have in Bloomington Normal, obviously State Farm, Country Financial, Rivian, different brands like that. But when you don't have unlimited funds from a revenue sharing standpoint, every little bit counts when you're trying to add value to help retain and recruit student athletes, right? So when you're looking at local businesses, whether it's gift in kind or $50 or whatever it may be, I think they all make an impact on all of our student athletes, because at the end of the day, we're likely not going to have any student athletes that have, like I said, deals with Nike or Gatorade or maybe even State Farm, even though it's based out of Bloomington Normal, right? But again, it's the livelihood of it. And especially for us, Bloomington Normal is such a close-knit town. Everybody bleeds red, literally and figuratively, for the Redbirds, right? Like, everybody loves the ISU Redbirds. And I think that's only helped us in the NIL space, right? Because we have a much more competitive advantage as compared to other Valley schools, just based on our market.
Yeah. So has that created like deeper storytelling ties that you're able to do? Because like you said, these community members and these businesses bleed bleed red, that they're like, the storytelling is just that much more authentic?
Yeah, I think it almost has to be, right? For the businesses to want to get an ROI or a return on it.
Uh-huh.
It has to be organic and it has to be authentic because again, for it to an impact on, their customers or reach on social media, um, it has to be genuine, right? Because I think anybody in the world can tell when a partnership is not genuine. Like it's very easy to spot that. Um, so I think that just adds more value to the business. Now, I think the tricky part though is getting some of the businesses to understand what influencer marketing really is, right?
Okay. Uh-huh.
We struggle with educating, all the stakeholders that are involved in NIL because it changes every day, right? Whether
Mm-hmm.
it's the
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, educating businesses is a whole nother ballgame because they got to run their business and try and figure out what we're trying to pitch them in a sense. So getting the businesses that may have, the old mindset of standardized, newspaper, radio ads, TV slots, getting them to understand what real impact influencer marketing can make and why it's beneficial to their brand.
So that's interesting because that's a problem that like everybody has, right? And especially like you said, with it changing ever so constantly. What and kind of okay, so these are challenges, we just talked about challenges that everybody faces. Focusing on the challenges that are maybe unique to the FCS level, what are some takeaways you think FBS programs could take away from how things work at the FCS level? Is it the relationship building that you have to do? Is it focusing more on the the authenticity of the deal? What are some takeaways that you would tell to an FBS school?
I mean, I think relationship building would be one, but just the efficiency, right? At the higher level, you hear about over the cap dollars, right?
Hmm.
At the 20.5 million in rev share, and then over the cap dollars are either through your MMR partners or your NIL directors that are going out there and trying to put together deals to essentially include those in packages that you're offering student athletes, which I get why that's part of it, but sometimes I think it's quality versus quantity,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Many of those to accumulate as many dollars as possible, which I certainly get that side of it, especially with how competitive it is at that level. Um, but I think it doesn't come to outspending people. I think you have to out connect and out execute individuals.
Okay.
So for us, like, at ISU, we don't have unlimited resources. We're $20.5 million school, and we know that. So how again do we control our own market and make sure that we're as efficient as possible, whether it's on the rev share side or the NIL side? I think you have to be extremely intentional with how you're prioritizing those things.
Okay, so I think this we're on the same wavelength here because I think these next two questions tie in perfectly with that. So then, how is success measured? Right? It's not always going to be financial. So how is success measured?
I think it's the lasting impact that we leave on our student athletes, right? In a world where you have so many choices to go several different places, how can we get student athletes that want to be Redbirds for life, right? What can we do on our end to make sure that they have the best experience possible as a student athlete during their time here? Because there's always going to be other things that they can chase, right? We obviously want to support our student athletes, whether it's here or whether they choose to go somewhere else. But I think it's when you can especially in this new era of college athletics, right? Because I think it was one thing to stay at a school for 4 years pre NIL,
Yeah.
uh,
Uh-huh.
but I think it's almost unheard of post NIL, right? And
Yeah.
that's not to I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Um, but again, it's just, for success is, how can we ensure that our student athletes, um, leave Illinois State as a better human being all around through their experience with NIL, their experience with their education as a student, and then obviously as an athlete on the, floor, field, or whatever sport it may be.
So, okay, now here's your opportunity to speak to those that are at your level, at the FCS level, right? There might be some schools that feel like they're behind, right? And they're like, oh, we don't have the, there might even be some that are like, we don't have the budget of Illinois State. They just competed for the national title, right? What do you say to those administrators who might feel like they're behind, right? Like, where should they start if they want to start building something and building something sustainably?
Focus on the people that you're investing in and not the outcomes, right? I think we all get caught up in, it's one thing to say that you want to play for a national championship, and it's another thing to do the things that are required to get to that stage, right? And it's,
Mm-hmm.
fortunately for us, we just played for national championship, so that's, easier said on our end. But at the FCS level, like, you have to align internally from, the top down, all the way from the athletic director all the way down to the GAs that are, playing a hand. So I think it comes down to, aligning from an administration standpoint, but then also with your coaches and student athletes, and then finally with your fan donors, right? Because for us, it's not true revenue sharing, and
Mm-hmm.
NIL as well. It's all donor funded at this level. So I think when
Mm-hmm.
you internally, and then also educate with your fans and donors for what it is that you want to do, whether it's launching an excellence fund or transitioning from your collective to an in-house model. Just make sure to communicate so that when it comes time to execute, everybody knows what's going on, and that's something we need to still do a better job at. But again, I think when you invest in people and you have a genuine approach to it, I think the results and um, I think it's so easy. We get lost in it too a little bit. There's some times where we feel like we're way behind everybody else, and then I hear from other individuals asking us how we're doing things right. So again, I
Mm-hmm.
think focusing on what it is that we're trying to build at Illinois State, and who we want to be, 3, 5, 10 years from now, because this thing's going to continue to change, right? So what we're doing, I mean, shoot, what we were doing a year ago to now is a complete 180. So how do
Mm-hmm.
we prepare for what's next and what's coming down the pipe? Um, because I call it the trickle down effect, right? What happens at the FBS level is going to trickle down to us at some form, especially in sports like football, men's and women's basketball. So how do we remain aligned internally to execute when those changes come? That was a very long answer, but
No, it's great. We like long answers here. What misconceptions exist with NIL at the FCS level, and what have what have you done to go about dispelling those during your time at Illinois State?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to NIL, at the FCS level. But my first two thoughts would be that it's either impossible or irrelevant, because I constantly hear from individuals saying that, well, you can't compete with the Power Fours. You never, let's use the U of I as an example, since they're 45 minutes down the road. You're never going to be able to be at the level that they're at. And while that might be true financially, I don't think it's irrelevant or impossible at this level. I think it just requires more discipline, and creativity, right? Because you don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited platforms that we can spend money on. Like, we have to be extremely intentional with the brand that we're putting out, but also how we do things internally, right? So whether that's NIL merchandise or a local partnership with a business, or I mean, you can go down the list of things. But I think it's just being incredibly aligned, but also having extreme attention to detail with what it is that we want to do. And again, I get the money piece of it, right? Like, I think that's the tough part of it all. I think it's people get lost in the difference between NIL and rev share.
Mm-hmm.
we're never going to be in the same bucket as some of the power fours in the revenue sharing space. But I think from an NIL standpoint, I do think that's where we can compete, right? Like we had a moment last year with one of our men's basketball players, Johnny Kinzinger. He cut his eye open during one of our rivalry games, and we put that on a T-shirt, and we titled it "Victory Runs Red," and we had no idea that that was going to be up for Moment of the Year with the NIL store next to, I think it was Jack Sawyer from Ohio State, Ashton Genty, and then a couple other men's basketball players. And I joke that we're just another mid-major, right?
I love that. So as NIL continues, NIL is going to continue to evolve, right? What does it look like, and what do you think the next phases look like for FCS programs to not only stay competitive, but maybe even what it takes and what's going to happen for those FCS schools to then make the jump to an FBS program?
I think it's going to take an investment from everyone, right? I think administrations are going to have to invest in more personnel to be able to handle the bandwidth of the demands, right? Because I look at, again, NIL and rev share is two different pots now, right? So like I'm meeting with coaches that have dollars to spend on the rev share side and figuring out things from a roster management strategy to evaluation to what it's going to take to retain our student athletes, and then on the NIL side, managing the day-to-day operations, and communicating with student athletes sometimes that may not be the best at communicating, making sure that they're fulfilling their deal, right? Whether it's posting on social media or going to that public appearance. It goes back to investing in people before outcomes. And then the second one is, a dollar or a financial investment from your fans and your donors, right? It takes what it takes at this level, and dollars are now a part of that, right? And I don't look at that as a disadvantage. Like I just look at that as another opportunity for our staff to get better, whether it's our fundraising self, higher up administration, like looking at it from a glass half full mentality of, how do we figure this out better than anybody else does, right? Because if you don't, someone else will.
So last couple of questions here. So let's say there's a student that comes to you, or you get an email from someone and they're like, "Hey, Brennan, I would love to work in NIL in the future, after I graduate." What advice would you give someone that wants to work in an NIL role on a campus?
Very good question. I get those all the time as well. There's a great piece of advice Maya gave me, who I think you've already had on the show, from Mississippi State. Because we talk about, professional goals and, kind of where I want to be down the road. And, her advice she gave me was, figure out what those roles are doing right now. And then what skills do you need to develop to then execute on what they do from a day-to-day basis, right? So like if I want to be a GM in the NFL one day or at a Power Four school, what are they doing right now? How can you learn those skills and start applying them at this level? Because, I may not work at a school like Texas or Florida or wherever, but how do I treat Illinois State like my big time, right? Like that's one of our use in our external department, like make ISU your big time. Because you don't rise to the level of the occasion, right? You sink to the standard that you're held to at all times. And that was a realization we had in the national championship, right? Like it's one thing to say it, but like when you're actually on that stage, you're either you're gonna show up or you're gonna get exposed. I would say, research what those skills are and take every opportunity you can, right? Like I was a football student athlete in college, and I took a GA opportunity with a track and field team. I probably could have told you about track and field. But you got to learn, right? You got to have humility, and you got to be adaptable. And I think that's the most important piece in NIL. Is like my job descriptions changed probably 5 or 6 times. It changed again over the summer with the house settlement. So understanding that the goalposts are always going to be moving, and it's going to be an incredibly dynamic environment. And I would say the final thing is, NIL, rev share, whatever you want to title it, is about people before it is money, in my opinion. Like, I am such a firm believer that relationships still matter with coaching staffs, your coworkers, but most importantly, the student athletes. And if you can learn to, again, like you win with people, if you can learn to, genuinely, love what you do and who you do it for, there's really nothing that can stop you, whether you want to work in college athletics or insurance or wherever it may be.
Last question. This is one that we ask to everybody. Let's say I were to come visit campus. What's the one go-to food spot that you're going to take me to? And you're like, you can't leave Normal without going here.
Pop-up chicken shop, man. It's like a mix of Chick-fil-A and Culver's combined.
Okay. I'm loving it.
Yeah, it's even better. That is hands down. If you ask a lot of our student athletes, that is the spot in town.
I love it. Well, I'm putting that on I'm saving it. I'm going to look it up on Google and I'm going to save it. And the next time I'm in Normal, that's where I'm hitting up. So, Brennan, thank you so much for joining us. And we really appreciate your time.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much for having me on. Roll Birds.
Thanks again to Brennan for joining us and telling us a little bit more about his work at Illinois State. If you'd like to connect with me, Sterling Randall, feel free to do so on LinkedIn. Also check out nilnewsstand.com for more updates and episodes. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also find out more about digital sport by Hot Paper Lantern at hpldigitalsport.com. And you can also find us and NIL Newsstand on LinkedIn. Hope everyone has a fantastic day, and we'll see you again next time.